Welcome to Militancy and Capitalism. This is Josh. In this episode, we speak with Khadijah Haynes about her recent piece, A Fetus on the Dirt Road, which offers a sharp critique of Western feminism's complicity in imperialism and its historical roots in racial violence. Haynes argues that Western feminism often obscures the struggles of both Black women and men, relying on colonial and anti-Black logics that fail to address the broader context of sexualized, gendered, and racialized abuses of all Black African people. We discuss other historical and contemporary critiques of feminism, argue that feminism does not hold a monopoly over women's liberation struggle, and try to offer some clarity on what this might mean for Black feminisms and other forms of feminisms that are trying to encompass a progressive or transformative philosophy. She emphasizes the need for a more inclusive and revolutionary framework that integrates the liberation of all oppressed peoples, critiquing both Western Marxism and feminisms for their limitations. In this regard, we also discuss quite explicitly the sexual violences faced by Palestinian and Black men, challenging the dominant narratives that obscure these experiences, and how dogmatism and essentialism of Western feminism has, more often than not, played a role in obscuring these experiences. Khadija is a lieutenant organizer in Brooklyn, writer, poet, and MC. As a Marxist-Leninist, her work centers the revolutionary struggles of oppressed people, both in the underbelly of the Imperial core and globally. If you like what we do and want to support our ability to have more conversations like this, please consider becoming a patron. You do so for as low as $1 a month. We bring these conversations totally independently with no corporate state or grant funding. Now, here's Khadija discussing some of her work. So we're here today talking with Khadijah Haynes about her recent piece, A Fetus on the Dirt Road, against Imperial feminism's claims of mass rape and exploring the theory of sepulchrality. And so you start off in this article telling the story of Hayes and Mary Turner. Can you discuss the story a bit and maybe touch on the relatedness to the rest of the piece?
Yeah, so I kind of situate the piece with the Turner family. Mary Turner and her husband Hayes Turner. They were working on a plantation with Hampton Smith in around May of 1918. And, many of the people that worked for the plantation, they were subject to a lot of vicious abuse, vicious attacks. And around this time also, people were just being lynched left and right. So essentially what happened with the Hayes family was that Hampton Smith, because he was so brutal and so horrible, found himself dead. Somebody murdered him. And, they were going around just looking for any, Black man that they can find to torture and blame for this rightful killing of this sadistic terrorist of Black people. And prior to that, I just wanted to also say that Mary Turner was also abused by Hampton Smith as well. And when Hayes Turner kind of pressed him about it, he was also beaten. And this was prior to that situation. But they found Hayes Turner. They, put him in jail arbitrarily, of course. And when Mary, when she was asked about it by the press, and she said that her husband did not commit this crime, she was in turn hunted down. The brutality of the murder is so painful to me, is so indicative of the kind of genocidal substrate that is Americanism, American violence, American liberalism. This is its foundations. And anyone who disputes that is living in some sort of delusion. But yeah, she was not only lynched, but she was lynched upside down. They doused her with gasoline. She was also 9 months pregnant, I think 8 or 9 months pregnant, if I'm not mistaken. And some pieces say that she was 19. Some places say that she was older. We're not quite sure. I want to say she was around maybe 19, 20 or so. Or, some places say that she was in her 30s. So I want to say that she was young, is what I want to say. And they knew that she was pregnant. She was visibly pregnant. They strung her upside down. They doused her with gasoline. And they just proceeded to beat her, mutilate her, and then riddle her body with bullets. And, they beat her so hard, the fetus of her unborn child, kind of, it fell out of her body. And they also beat the unborn child and kicked it. It was just brutal. I don't know if you want to cut this, but I'm saying I think it's important to speak to the particular brutality of, they crushed the head of the child. And I want to talk about the specific brutality because it's not an isolated kind of sadism. It is something that is endemic to Western imperialism, to Western values, Western Anglo-Saxon Christian values. It's it is it is the kind of sustenance of Western imperialist viciousness. And so I wanted to be as vivid and I wanted it to be as disturbing as possible because I wanted people to really viscerally feel that pain, because it's so easy for people to disconnect, or to become numb. We see it all the time with what's happening in Palestine where people, I don't know, even I ask myself, how can you just scroll through and see something so demonstrably just vile and just go out and have a cup of coffee? I really feel like you just have to become undone in yourself. So I wanted to situate the piece in something so viscerally disturbing and so painfully violent that it kind of forces you to stop in yourself and to not only pay attention, but to go to a place that is even deeper than attention and just really be there in yourself. Yeah, so that is what happened with the Turner family. And I actually learned about it many, many years ago. And I never been able to forget, it just always stayed with me, stayed with me, stayed with me. Like even now as I'm talking about it again, it just makes me emotional. I wasn't even really so much politicized, like strongly. It was very like embryonic at the time. And I read this and I was like, I remember actually I was at a bus stop and I was on my way to work and I was like, what the hell did I just read for the entire day? And I just I just wanted to tell the story with her, not for her.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to kind of get into like the theoretical or historical aspects of this piece outlines a broader critique of Western feminism or imperial feminism. Of course, you cannot tell the story of empires, emergence, and expansion without also telling the story of how important white feminism was and is to its maintenance, right? How early civilizing missions relied on the language and practices of what has come to be dominantly known as feminism. You write that, and I'm quoting here, Western feminism, moreover, foregrounds a racist genealogy. The violently racist logics of white criminologists lie at the taproot of Western feminism, which views colonized people as reified objects they can mutilate and exoticize. Hence, the colonial epistemologies of Western feminism lays the ground and provides a legal framework for the imperial axis of murder that justifies the slaughter of colonized people a world over, end quote. So can you talk a bit about this critique you have for Western feminism and why you see it as something that is worth ruthless investigation and criticism and antagonizing?
Yeah, actually, I just want to say originally, the piece was written for a party that I was a part of, and I published it there first in two parts. And it was a white woman from the party actually stopped me and was like, excuse me, why are you coming down on the feminists like this? And it was just like an elderly, white woman. And it was just such a like strange encounter. Like, God forbid a poor Black woman narrates her own story. And this is one of my biggest problems. It's like the suffragette movement with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but not only Stanton, Samuel A. Cartwright, and I want to, pay homage to Dr. Thomas Curry because he really delves into it. And I know a lot of people have a lot of unnecessary smoke for him and everything like this, but he lays this out so perfectly. And I'll speak to this more throughout the conversation, but this is the undercarriage of Western feminism. This racist campaign to denigrate Black men as savage using, racist ethnological kind of assertions at the time and so-called studies of the time to say that these men, and they literally say this, that anybody can, just do a quick search, that, their main problem was, why would you give us the vote? Why wouldn't you give us white women the vote? Black men are incapable of ruling anything. They don't have any intellectual capacities. They are like children. Some places quote that, the brain, Black men in certain parts of their brain or something like this is placed, they have a more submissive character that is just more geared towards being inferior and thereby justifying them being subjugated. And this is your framework. This is your groundwork. This is your base. This is where you're working from. And I know people would say, well, even though this is the base that, other feminisms that have been birthed from this are much different and it's not the same thing. And I have to say, like, this is such a mistaken idea. This was birthed from the loins of, violent racism, this Western feminism. And if this is where we are situating ourselves, this is where our standpoint is, this is where we see ourselves ontologically, this is a problem. This is a real problem. And it shows itself to be such a problem. And for me, ethnological, racist, so-called data from Samuel A. Cartwright, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, quoting Sojourner Truth with things that she didn't even say, just to kind of make sure to denigrate the Black male, to pull Black women from the Black community and to say, you need to work with us to fight against the savage Black male because, they're going around, they have capacity to just rape and kill the precious, virtuous, unsoiled white woman and things like this. This is what you take to be your root. And if you take this to be your root, it is poison from root to stem. And I think that I'm not knocking nobody if they still, adhere to it and things like this. I left that train a long time ago. I'm just asking you, before you want to denigrate me and the piece, go back and look at this, because Kimberly Crenshaw has quoted these racist ass criminologists of the 19th century. She's taken from, kind of Moynihan so-called data and things like this to kind of further pathologize the Black community. This is where she actually quotes, I think, Wolfgang and Ferracuti in her piece to talk about intersectionality. They're quoting these people, these racist, violent people that they say they're trying to hedge against, but they're using it to bolster and to sustain their framework. How is that not a problem?
No, yeah, definitely. And shifting gears, but not really, actually, because you're still kind of on this in this point. But I want to talk a bit about the increasingly petty bourgeois class character of Black feminism, something you highlight in this article, something that Joyce James discusses in a way as well. So can you discuss this a bit?
Yeah, and this is the thing the most, in the 1970s when Black studies was emerging and gender studies and Black feminist studies was, becoming an emergent philosophy, you see the kind of liberalizing of the field taking shape. And you also see the way that, the Gloria Steinems of the world and these types of women are able to just, fit comfortably in these spaces and funnel money into these frameworks and things like this. They wouldn't be doing that if it was really something that was really geared towards dismantling the capitalist patriarchal normative structure. They wouldn't do this. And because of that, because of this sort of professional managerial kind of feminism that emerges, that purports to speak for all Black women, it becomes very disconnected from the very community that they seek to speak for. And, it takes on a petty bourgeois, state allegiance kind of character to it. And it's been that ever since. And if anybody, people want to refute me on this, go back, look at who's funding these things. Look at who's funding these things. It's, it's not coming from the ground up. It's coming from, institutions that, CIA cutouts, and this is well documented history also. So, to not understand that, to me, I really feel like it's dishonest. You're doing a dishonest project. And I think Dr. Curry, he also points this up, because, it's being funded by these institutions and it's being co-opted by academia. It's completely ripped of any real marrow and gristle from it. And you get these very distorted, racist apologist kind of frameworks that say, Black men are this, Black men are all rapists. Just crazy, crazy, crazy things. Now, that's not to say we don't have to speak to the misogyny in our community and the problems that we have in our community. But it's not to say that you're just going to brand an entire group of people. And some of them even go as far as to say that, it's okay if these people are imprisoned because they are hurting our community. And this is the most racist anti-Black shit ever. Yeah. Completely liberal and completely capitalist ideology.
Yeah, this is something that I have found myself increasingly concerned with over the years, and I've been trying to find a way to most appropriately and accurately, as well as trying going out of my way to almost avoid the inevitable, backlash, as many as have had to navigate with that, I'm saying, both on the internet, but also in even left progressive type of spaces as well, which I've had these debates in. And this is I'm trying to have this understanding and this empathy, right? And also involving both in my analysis and also in how we even engage in struggle, well, while not being, for one, idealistic, right, about the conditions that we are facing, if that makes sense, right? That we do know that there is a systemic phenomenon of historical misogyny, specifically targeting Black women, while also still finding a way to do it in a way that does not reduce Black men to simply caricatures of the most violent or the most backward, or yeah, I'm saying. So it's something that I think that is again, many of us have seen over the years again. And one of the most, we're going to touch on this a little more later, but I do kind of want to touch on this a bit here. This idea that how does the caricature of the Black male rapist form, right? And then seeing the kind of reproducing of that caricature under the guise of even a progressivism, right? A liberal progressivism or a radical liberalism that we keep seeing. And it emerges and maintains a prevalence within current discourses, but it evolves, if that makes sense as well. And so I don't know, I just keep having this struggle with trying to navigate those waters, if that makes sense. And I know you have as well, right? Because I've seen you talk about this. So it's how do you on one hand, again, acknowledge, struggle against, right, patriarchal violence, specifically as it pertains to the women, specifically Black women, right? And then at the same time, we're working on the assumption of an expanded understanding of patriarchy that is not just limited to women and the violence that they experience at the hands of men, but also men, right? Specifically racialized men and the violence that they experience both at the hands of women, but also at the hands of the state and at the hands of like obviously of white men, right? And so like there's these like, and that's kind of the biggest issue, right? Is that we're at this place where like we have very different understandings of patriarchy, simply put. I think that's one of the main antagonists, right? That we understand. Most people understand patriarchy is something that is like happens to women at the behest of men, right? And then like we have this about me, for example, I've studied this over the last couple of years. So I've been having a different like understanding of patriarchy that like, oh no, it's actually far greater than just that, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously many others' opinion, even Tommy Curry's opinion, right? I've had this discussion with you and Joy James, for example, in the last couple of years as well. I know you do as well, right? And so how do you even like reckon with that antagonism is basically what I'm saying here.
That's tough. It's tough. It's tough. And I'm so happy, because I don't know, people probably have all kinds of assumptions about the things that I say. But let me tell y'all, I'm speaking as a Black woman. I'm from fucking Flatbush. I live in Brownsville. I was a cashier in a hair store for most of my life, actually. I don't have a big fancy education. I went to York for a little bit. I didn't finish. I have a daughter. And so my experiences, even from someone like Joy James, who I look up to and respect her work so much, and she has really helped me think through things a little bit more. I actually did an interview or like a talk with her when I was in the Communist Party USA. She came to the building and, seeing the love that she still held for these women, it just kind of made me feel like I need to be more careful, I need to be more careful. At the same time, Black feminism it has devoured, I would say, I think is a better word. It has consumed the racist tropes about Black people, not only Black men, and took it as a framework and say that we're going to use these racist tropes that have been peddled against our people to say that this is a liberatory framework. I'll give you an example. I was reading something with Erica Edwards where she talks about intersectional invisibility, and she purports that because Black men are, lynched publicly and because they are more, I guess, seen, that this kind of obscures or deletes the pain and savage violence that Black women go through at the hands of Black men, of course, because it's always just only about Black men. And this was so like mad disturbing to me. I'm like, okay, so you're saying that, and she actually says this also, and I quote, that we need to move away from, these kind of frames where we just rally around only Black men because they are publicly murdered, because she claims that Black women are, killed more in private or something like this. And that we need to kind of focus on this like really obscure notion of like people building. And it's not really clear what she's even talking about with this. But I'm just saying, like, who are these women speaking for, yo? Like, I don't know who these women are speaking for. You're not speaking to me. You're not speaking to me and my homegirls. You're not speaking to us. I don't know who y'all speaking for. Because up here in Brownsville, we don't think like this. We don't think like this. And it's not because, you people, you're very astute and intellectual and everything. Inside of that intellectuality is such a decay. How could you say that because Black men are being murdered en masse, that this somehow obscures the murder of Black women, as if, and it's just so, what's the word I'm looking for? It just severs our community in such a way that the rupture, it's like a continuum, an unending rupture or something, because as soon as we try to move towards any sort of mending, here comes Erica Edwards, here comes the Christina Scharf, and here comes all these other people. And it's like, no, Black men,
raping women. I even was reading through Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider, and she said that, Black men hate lesbians and they are threatened by lesbians, and what they want to do, if we say anything against that, they're going to wipe us out. And it's just like, what? And it's like just wild claims, and we need to, what if we broke up with them? What if we love them from a distance, but we broke up with Audre Lorde? We broke up with Christina Sharp. We broke up with these women, and we said, you know what? We're going to take, I come from the tradition of Claudia Jones, of Queen Mother Moore, Nadezhda Krupskaya, Selma, a sister named Selma. Her last name is remissing me right now for some reason. From Trinidad, a staunch Marxist-Leninist. I come from these tradition of these women, and they're strong in their anti-imperialism. They take care of the communities, but they don't attach this label of feminist to themselves. They've never done it. It's like people have attached those labels to them, and they do it posthumously. They don't do it, while these women are alive and moving, because to us, moving towards liberation and treading in the blood and the waters of liberation, caring for our people, caring for our children, caring for our mothers, caring for our sisters, caring for our men. This is just Black life. It's not a feminism. This is Black life. And what hurts me is that these women theorizing in this bubble, they don't want to hear what poor Black women have to say. They want to speak for us. But when it's time for us to speak for ourselves, they don't want to hear anything that we have to say. And this notion, I also wanted to complicate, and I should have, wanted to talk about this more and maybe in another piece, the notion of sisterhood. And, shout out to Aquia, she actually helped me kind of think through this more, because I felt like even in my critique, like I was still holding on to, like, I just want to find common ground with the Black feminist. I just want to, like, still maintain like a sisterhood thing. And, she actually said to me, like, you can't have a sisterhood with these people. They're the way that the vitriol that they level against you if you disagree. How do you only have a sisterhood that is contingent upon me just agreeing with you? That's not a sisterhood. That's a subjugation. And so even the notion of bonding around this stereotypes that you level against your own people, the Black community, you form a sisterhood around that. It's even more than trauma bonding. It's like anti-Black bonding that they're rallying around. And I just really want to ask these women to stop. Like, Bell Hooks, she talks a lot about love and Buddhism. And as actually a follower of Buddhism and Hindu philosophy, I'm just like, how can you have love without self-reflection? How can you have a love without self-inquiry? How can you have a love without ruthless self-critique? And I'm not saying that, I haven't read all of the feminist and gender theory, so there's still room for me to learn more there. And I'm welcome and I'm open to critique. But these people, they want to hold on to a very a priori utopian notion of womanhood that excludes poor Black women, that excludes, women who have a different purview. Even when Michelle Wallace's Black Macho and the Superwoman, there was Black women at the time who were saying, this is untrue. Like, this what you're writing isn't based in the truth of the Black community and the Black liberation movement. And what's slick about Black feminism is that it is a rightist ideology in the fact that it will say things like Black nationalism, is the problem. Actually, even years later, Michelle Wallace, she still literally says that, Black nationalism is a impediment to the liberation of Black people. And so they excuse the racist violence of white women. They excuse it, and they're able to say, no, we want to create a bridge with white women because we have these bridges on our backs and whatever. We want to create this bridge with white women, but, we don't want anything to do with Black men because, they're all rapists. And even some of them, they excuse the racist murder and lynching of Black women by white men. They excuse it as, and say that, because the mimetic theory, the mimesis, and Dr. Curry again talks a lot about this, that, Black men are just trying to mimic, white patriarchy. And when the data actually shows that Black men have always been more progressive. And that's, again, not to say that there's a lot of problems in our community, but the violence is a violence of familial, different interpersonal, intimate relationships. It's all like bidirectional. It's not unidirectional violence between the Black woman and Black man. We have been stolen and cut asunder in violence because of this capitalist imperialist structure, because we have been oppressed for so long. So it manifests itself in all of these different ways. And to single out just these one group of people and to say they're irredeemable and to say that we should just, constantly cut them down, this is wrong. We have to hold them accountable. And even the notion of accountability, is vulgarized because there's no self-reflection around as a whole. It's just like you just want one group of people to just self-reflect on that. And this is why I feel like it's not a liberatory framework. It's not. I don't know. You got me all riled up.
No, I appreciate it. And it's something I think that last point, right, it not being a liberatory framework, I'm interested in that aspect because this is something that I've been discussing with regard to like the Black male studies versus the Black feminism discourses that take place online, but also it's not just online. Again, I want to like emphasize that it's not exclusive to just like online Twitter debates. It's very much beyond that. And it's something that like, it's very clearly like ramping up and intensifying as like, I feels like people's conditions are worsening. I think that there is like people, a stratified like solutions are happening, right? People are choosing sides and leaning more into doubling and tripling down on their own ways of thinking. And sometimes it's like with the Black male studies camp, sometimes with the Black feminist camp, sometimes it's with, the vesters or the incel like types that are popping up on the internet as well. It brings me to this question of like, which framework, right, if any, is going to get us to a place where we are actually activating people politically, right? Getting people involved in political struggle and involved in trying to transform not just themselves, but each other, right? And their conditions, of course, as well. And so it's like, and this gets me to the question of back to what you were talking about with the institutionalization of like Black feminism, right? And it's like, I guess you can argue, right, because Black male studies is something that is, largely being worked through intellectually, theoretically speaking, within the academy as well, that it can suffer the same fate, if that makes sense, right? And so I think one of the biggest issues that we have is that people understand feminism having a monopoly on women's liberation when that is not the case. As you mentioned, like women like Khadijah Jones, for example, who had an analysis of like, women's role or like rather women's subjugation as it relates to like the state, for example, right? And in her analysis, and we have other examples, right, of women, particularly communist women, right, left-wing radical women, right, who had analysis of like women's liberation and without actually identifying as feminists, right? And participating in struggle without actually identifying the struggle as a feminist struggle, if that makes sense. And so, but rather we understand that like, okay, now feminism does not have a monopoly on women's liberation struggle, right? Quite the opposite. There's many movements that are happening worldwide, right, that are engaged in and participate or at the forefront of women's liberation that are not specifically feminist struggles. So again, if that is the case, then like, how do we get to a place where we are engaged in struggle, right? Because I think one of the things we see now is that like, I feel like feminism is almost, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but like, I feel like feminism in the US context, its most dominant iteration is not really a political struggle, right? A grassroots political struggle. Am I wrong to think that? Like in this, I'm trying to like, I'm truly like.
It's a culturalist sort of essentialist struggle.
for, I just, want better wages, and, there's too many male CEOs, and it's just more about like a careerism path. It's just more about complaints about, you know, Black women in their careers, well-to-do petty bourgeois Black women who feel like they're not afforded the same rights as, these white women or these white men. But when you get down to the suffering and the pain and the murder, the dispossession in housing, you don't these people, they don't really speak to it with as much ferocity as they will speak to it with regards to like ways in which they feel like Black men have disregarded them or, oppressed them or something like this. And I wanted to speak to why it's not a liberatory framework. It's not a liberatory framework because if you're using the very stereotypes that white people have of Black people, and you're consuming that and you're recycling it, twisting it into various iterations and things like this, into sectionality, into whatever, taking that same racist ethnological assertions and logic and reasonings and saying that, this is liberatory because you've remixed it and you put some other shit in there. This is anti-Black, and it's antithetical to liberation. If you don't even have to strip it down. If you just really, some people have this myopia on, take the myopia, off and really see it for what it is. It is, I've been reading something by, Klus Card, and he has this theory of like seduction. I feel like Black feminism seduces Black women into thinking that if we adhere to this framework, then somehow that we're going to be liberatory, we're going to find these bonds of sisterhood, and we're just really going to come into our own. And a lot of times people just end up feeling like, for myself, like more confused, unable to feel like, poor Black women, don't have a voice. And then those people, someone mentioned Loretta Ross, and, I'm not saying that she didn't do, good work in terms of reproductive rights and things like this, but we have to like kind of mine down into the kind of embedded anti-Blackness inside of Black feminism. And Myron J. Gilmore, who's I think someone you should definitely speak to, has a dissertation on counterinsurgency where he talks about Huey P. Newton, and he actually goes into a lot how Black feminist thought has been utilized in the Black community to destroy revolutionary movements, and how they have specifically targeted Black women to help in these endeavors because they feel like, the counterinsurgents have some notion that, Black women are not the ones in leadership, and, Black women are, more docile. But, Erica Huggins, she actually spoke to this and said, they were making a big mistake by thinking that Black women weren't the ones in leadership in the Black Panther Party, because they were in all the leadership in the Black Panther Party. You know what I mean? But just the way that they targeted the women of the Black Panther Party to kind of make the Black community submit to this counterinsurgent neoliberal frame, it's painful, and they've done it also with, I forget the book that Myron mentions in the piece, but he talks about the Middle East, and he talks about the notion of white women, Western women coming in talking about, we want to remove the veil, we want to remove the hijab because it's a symbol of oppression, and we want you to be free and whatever. And they're not coming in to give you freedom. They're coming in to further subjugate and rape the land and the people. I was talking to, Aquia, and I remember her saying something like, this notion of, the Western education and, the unveiled Muslim women, indigenous women having, access to these jobs and this career and this education. She was saying, it's almost like if you're going to have this kind of counterinsurgent education, it's better to have no education at all. because it's almost like they're utilizing this education for you to kind of further indict your own communities, whether it be Muslim men, whether it be Black men, whether it be Arab men, I mean. And I struggle to see and to feel for myself when you say things like Black nationalism, revolutionary Black nationalism is an impediment to Black women's redefining themselves and really coming into their own being. This is disturbing, because if you say that, then you're saying that the best we can do as a Black people is to reform ourselves and to just accept capitalism, fight for reforms, fight for these nebulous, amorphous, anti-racist campaigns, fight for better careers or some fucking shit. And the best we can do is be reformers. If we dare to fight for our liberation as a people and to go up against the fucking state, then you become authoritarian, you become Stalinist, and you become like a violent, like Black macho that's out to rape and kill Black women. It's such a reactionary ideology. And, outside of the online debates, I'm an organizer, in my community. And you do have people in the organizing realm who do hold these like kind of reactionary views too. And it's a fucking impediment to organizing. It's an impediment, these inculcated, racist, wrong ideas that you have about your own people, about Black people, that you're trying to organize, that revolutionary Black nationalism, Black liberation movements, suffer from machismo, and they're just like the white man, and they're trying to do this like sub-patriarchy and this mimesis theory to say that, this is liberation. And if you dare try to challenge this and say that, Black revolutionary Black nationalism is a framework of freedom, then you're excusing patriarchy and you haven't recognized the nuances and all of this shit. It's so messed up, and it has messed up our people. I don't know. It just makes me upset talking about it sometimes.
Yeah, and that's kind of like gets to our next point, right? How Black feminism has been used to delegitimize militant Black power movements. And of course, there's like the obvious and most popular examples of like Bell Hooks, right? And talking about George Jackson, for example. And there's other examples, of course, as well that you're going to evoke here. But you just kind of touched on this, right? But for folks who may not be aware of this criticism, can you maybe even further lay out how you imagine this is so?
I mean, like I said, Michelle Wallace is the myth of the, the superwoman and the Black macho, Alice Walker's writing, of course, Hooks' writings, and then you have later people like Pench and, like when you say that, okay, all of the revolutionary Black nationalist movements suffer from this violent patriarchy, it's almost like you're saying that, people should move away from this and people should just, seek to reform, the system. If you're just a wholesale indictment of revolutionary Black nationalism and inherently patriarchal and sadistic, then you're not giving us any options at all. I mean, Michelle Wallace has, really a wholesale indictment of Black nationalism. I mean, when we talk about the revolutionary history, we're talking about, like Ida B. Wells, we're talking about, Denmark Vesey, we're talking about all of the sisters in St. Croix and their liberation movement, the essential role that Black women played in Haiti in the revolutionary movement there, the Black women who taught Dessalines how to fight in Haiti. You're just removing this whole history, and you're telling us the best that we can do is to leave the savage Black male rapist aside because you have consumed this caricature given to you by the white patriarchal system that you say you claim to be against, and side with try to build a coalition with white women and try to struggle for, reforming the system. Because if you dare to dismantle it, then you're just going to have all of these inherent patriarchies and all of this machismo. And I just find it really, really disturbing. But if you look to the work of Alice Walker, Michelle Wallace, even, what's her name? Elaine Brown, Erica Huggins, they have talked about the patriarchy within or the misogyny within the Black Panther Party. And there's a conflation of the two, like patriarchy and misogyny. Those are two different things, and Dr. Curry points this out, like, historically, Black men have been labeled children, incapable, because they have a submissive part of the brain or something like this that white men don't have. These men have been divested of manhood and kind of made to be viewed as childlike, creatures by white society. So all of a sudden, during the 50s or something, like, things change and now they're patriarchs. And now we have to take this notion of, the Black male patriarchy, and it just completely rips the substance and the broad history of Black liberation movements. What Michelle Wallace and Alice Walker and the rest of these people are pointing to, in actuality, is, I find, an allegiance to the capitalist, white supremacist, heteronormative structure. They're not really seeking to free themselves from it. They're seeking more to be recognized by the state, not to be free from the state. Or they're seeking a reform by the state. But to really go up against the state, to undo those fetters, it's authoritarian, it's machismo. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. And we're cutting down our revolutionary potential. We're cutting down the revolutionary possibility and promise of something different, of a world where Black women and, women of color, working class women overall can actualize themselves as whole beings. You're cutting that and you're stealing that away from us. It's problematic, and we really need to complicate these notions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that point, right, complicating it is an important one, because I do think that we have come to understand these things in very simplistic terms. And it reminds me a lot, actually, of the kind of race versus class discussion, historically speaking, right, where it's like, everyone is always like, oh, we need to prioritize race, we need to prioritize class. And it's like, okay, to me, it's both, obviously. Like, it's both. And I see this very same phenomena happening sometimes amongst gender studies discourses, if that makes sense. Women's and gender studies, genuinely speaking, where, like, people at times, even under the guise of intersectionality, will subordinate, right, analyses of, like, race and class in favor of gender, as opposed to understanding these things as alongside each other, right? Constantly, right? That you can't divorce one from the others. You can't, at any point in time, you cannot discuss these things as divorced from one another. And yet that's how it happens, right? One or two, or multiple of them get divorced or subordinated in favor of the other. And then we come to these kind of reactionary discourses, as we're seeing, as constantly underway, I think, because I think people would like to believe that, like, there's easy and straightforward explanations for social phenomena, specifically in the realm of, like, patriarchal violence, for example, where, like, even if you want us to suggest, right, that, like, that there are more complicated analyses of, like, the phenomena of, like, I'm saying domestic violence, for example, than just straightforward that, like, men are bad or men are violent, rather that, like, I'm saying that there's been studies about how, like, alcoholism and, labor exploitation and stresses from labor exploitation, for example, all these factors, there are like 10,000 different, factors that contribute to the phenomena of domestic violence. And then you even have to complicate that again, because we know that, like, racialized men or men, generally speaking, have and can be victims of sexual and domestic violences, of course, as well. But that is even more so in the case of, like, Black men, historically speaking, as there's been studies about, right? And this is one of the things that have changed for me. I tell people this all the time, and not to, like, do TMI, but, like, one of the things that, like, really made me rethink things as someone who, like, came up, like, I owe a great debt to, like, feminist studies. I truly do. And that's why, like, even in this call, it may seem like I'm sympathetic to it, something that I want to redeem in a sense. And I've had this discussion actually with Akuya, the same person you mentioned earlier, right? Because they actually disagree with me on this. Like, I've had this understanding that, because I really do believe wholeheartedly in like the function and the utility and the importance of like women's liberation struggle, simply put, and that not being distinct from, right, how I understand, right, a communist struggle ultimately. So those things work in tandem, right?
I completely agree. And I think that, I think if you love something or if you love someone, you have to critique it in a good faith way. I don't think that, I would hope people don't think I'm being bad faith when I'm pointing to say that, the way that, yes, I'm sorry that they think that, because, I'm a Black woman. Let me tell, like, not to be TMI, but I've been through some motherfucking shit. You know what I'm saying? Like, a lot of these people, sometimes if all you want to do is, have a career where you don't experience any antagonisms in your wage, and you just want to be at the top of your game as compared to white men because they're getting paid more. If that is just like your whole world, and the way you're being discriminated against in the workplace, and, the real shit that Black women like myself are going through on a daily basis, it's completely left out the window. Like, you know what I mean? And I generally, like I said, I was reading Audre Lorde, and when she opened Sister Outsider with the way she's talking about her trip to Russia, just going through it, and the way she just pulls you in, and the way, the writing is just so lucid and so beautiful and so sensual and intimate. And, when we talk about like Pat Parker, I owe a great depth to these women as well. But I also say in the piece, we can love our mothers and we can love our sisters. And we could also acknowledge how our mothers and our sisters have kind of dismembered us in a way, have kind of positioned themselves against us or above us. And it's something that I'm struggling with. When I say that, Black feminism is not a liberatory ideology, when you position yourself in such a way that you are able to reap the benefits of cutting down an entire group of people, and you're able to get book deals and talk shows and funding from foundations and things like this. And instead of using it to work against the mechanisms and violence of the state, it's used to kind of, in a slick way, align with the state against a group of people and take the racist ideology of the state given to us by the state against our own people, against Black men, against Black women, and say that this is the real revolutionary ideology.
Right.
How disrespectful. And you're not only disrespecting me, these women will put their Assada's names all up in their mouth. They need to stop it. Everybody's Assada's daughter. Assada's daughter didn't have any allegiance to the state.
Mm-hmm.
How are you Assada's daughter? How are you Assada's anything? And I don't want to say that they are an enemy. I feel like they need to be held accountable for the way that they've misled and hurt us, and to the way that they have cut down any Black women or Black man or any Black person that has disagreed with them. Because if you don't agree with these people, they will eat you up.
Mm-hmm.
And then act like they're the victim. So I don't know, Josh. I feel like I am also sympathetic more than some people, but I felt like I've let go of trying to be accepted by Black feminists and Black feminism. I feel like we need something else. I feel like we need to return to the theory of triple oppression by Louise Thompson Patterson and built on by Claudia Jones. Even in the first even in the statement of the Combahee River Collective, I live and die by the statement when they said, we struggle with Black men against racism, and we struggle against Black men in their misogyny. That's where I'm at with it. That's where we need to examine that. I don't know, Beverly and Barbara Smith, they've gone on to, participate in this, unfortunate, like, imprisoning project when it comes to Black people, I find. But in that instant, you saw the possibility, you saw the beauty. I just feel like even when we talk about anti-imperialism, they don't want to talk about anti-imperialism. They want to just talk about the way that the Black men all over the world have violently abused Black women. And they only pick out anecdotal instances and make broad claims and kind of the way that they kind of distort statistics to fit the narrative that they have in their head. This is a CIA, kind of project, that we're working with. And I do think even when I see Black women who critique Black feminism, there's been some instances of, a so-called reflection. Even then, if you say that you're critiquing Black feminism, but they only go so far. They'll revert back to, we need to have a more anti-imperialist outlook, or, we need to acknowledge, the violence against Black men. But at the end of the day, Black women are, still abused by Black men, and we need to just hold them accountable. And they're obsessed with holding people accountable, but when the fuck are you going to hold yourself accountable for what the hell you have done to the Black community, the way you have cut down liberation movements with your twisted ideologies of Black machismo and the myth of the Black rapist. Dr. Tommy Curry has an essay called He's a Rapist When He's Not. And I suggest everybody read this because he's talking about Willie McGee and the way that he was viciously attacked and imprisoned by the lies of this white woman who, wanted to be with him and imposed herself on him sexually. And when she saw that he had a Black wife, then it was, oh, he raped me now. Or, he talks also about Richard Wright's Working Men, I think is the name, or Workmen or is the name. And he talks about how Richard Wright has a story where he delves into this character that he created of this Black man who had to wear a dress to go in to pretend to be a woman and a nanny for this white family. And the white man ends up trying to rape what he thinks is a Black woman, but it's actually a Black man. And not to mention the vicious rape of a Black man. And I think, is it Thomas A. Foster is the person's name?
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah. I mean, when you hear, and the way that white women have participated in this violent rape,
right.
It's not like they just was like idly, looking past it or something. They actively participated in it. There's one account that Dr. Curry gives of, I want to say it's in He's a Rapist When It's Not piece, of the way that they talk about, the white woman has realized the sexual power that she has over the Black man and the gratification and the yearning that she's able to get from that. Not to mention the psychosexual violence against Black men. We can talk about Abdou Diallo. We can talk about Palestinian men. Just the other day, I heard that, in the Said Timan prison, they inserted things in this man's rectum and viciously raped him. I mean, the abuse goes on and on against racialized men. And, when you talk about this, you get labeled all kinds of pick-me's and things like this. And, why is it that when you're concerned with the liberation of your whole people and not this culturalist, essentialist distortion, that somehow you're all kinds of names? And it's like, I don't even, if you ever pay attention, I don't even come for these people. They just come in my, post or whatever. They get really upset. They call me all kinds of names. And I don't say anything back, but it's just like, if you don't agree, you're not in the sisterhood. The sisterhood
Mm-hmm.
of destruction is like a fucking cult.
Yeah, and on a vein that you said earlier too, I think there's like, and this is something again, and what I was going to say earlier about this, like the TMI aspect, right? Is like, I remember having a discussion with like a good like, it was about 8 to 12 of us, and it was all Black men, and I don't know even how we got in this discussion, but we got to discussion of like virginity. Which obviously we know now is like fake, but like it was just years ago. And but like so, we were just like discussing like obviously like how like Curry would use it, right? The sexual debuts, for example, and it was almost everybody in this discussion, myself included, talked about like when that we first had our first sexual encounter, and then when we got into the details about it, we realized not almost every single one of us were like victimized by sexual predation in a way that many of us, not myself, but like others, right, we were like downplayed it or like laughed it off, as in like didn't even think much about it as like sexual violence, but just like thought about it as like, oh, this is like a natural thing that happens to like, young Black boys specifically. I'm thinking about it in terms, it was girls. It was the older women that like were the perpetuators of like this sexual predation, if that makes sense. And so, and it was in that moment, I think, because again, I want to say earlier, as I said earlier, like I like was like raised through feminist studies, for example, right? I've read a lot of this literature, right? I read the bell hooks, I read the Algie Laurie when I was 18, 19 years old, And so like it kind of like, and again, coming up in feminist studies, right? You're holding up the real cool books. I also read that in undergrad, right? It's like, it's funny to me because it's like coming up within feminist studies where we were trained even to understand like patriarchy as like something that happens to women. It's almost exclusively, that is how my institution, right, taught me or like trained me to understand feminist studies. And again, I like myself, right, I did my own studies and I was breaking away from that already. But one of the things that made me like interested, because I actually had an encounter with Curry, I mean, like 2018, 2019, something like that. But like I disagreed with him vehemently on the internet. We had like a back and forth. And I was like, honestly, quite militant in my understanding of like, of his politics, right, at that time. But it was because of this encounter that I had with other Black men. It's like, and I realized in that moment that what happened to me was like not an exception. It was nothing exceptional about it, but rather it was a systemic issue that we see, right? That like that plagues so many of like, I feel like most, Black folks, generally genderless speaking or gender neutral speaking, but honest, specifically in this case, Black boys and men have some level of experience with this, right? Experiences sexual violence at some point in their lives. But like this gets disappeared. And so much of like these literature, feminist literature, I would say, I read a book years ago that was like talking about, because I've read so many texts about like sexuality and slavery, of course, it's one of my big interests of mine. But there's a text, I can't remember what it's called. I could probably figure it out later and then come back to you. But I know for a fact it was written by a white woman though. And it was, I remember reading the intro and it was like, it like used the sexual violence that Black men specifically experienced during slavery and use it as like a footnote. It was like, oh yeah, like it happened, but like we're going to focus here on Black women, which is fine. It's hard to write a book about like specifically the sexual violence that Black women faced during slavery. I'm not saying that is the issue, but it's a way that it was like kind of just like in pursuit of a greater narrative, of a traditional feminist narrative, just kind of like overwrite it, I guess, or just like downplay it, or like just pretends like it's like it's a footnote. It's not actually something that deserving of investigation. And it wasn't until I read, right, Thomas Foster or even Curry's work and a couple others' work where I was like, oh, this like it was actually something that happened far more often than I understood it when I read a lot of the feminist texts. And so like the feminist texts are almost obscuring and erasing these like wide systemic experiences that are happening because it does not contribute or like, you know what I'm saying, or forward this traditional understanding of patriarchal violence, right? And we are to understand that women, specifically white women in this case, right, are perpetuators historically of patriarchal violence and are active participants in patriarchal violence in the patriarchal white supremacist capitalist state that we see today, right? And then that entirely, fucks up and destabilize one of the primary narratives of like the feminist analytic. Right. And so it makes sense why all this is happening. I'm not saying anything even new here. This is just a reflection of like the like my understanding of the literature that I read over the last couple of years. But this upsets people. I've realized, and as you've seen yourself, like people, like I've come to like understand like that we actually, the way we understand patriarchy is limited. And we see this in many other cases. And I see now, even more so now, that people just categorically do not know how to talk about patriarchal violence, domestic violence, sexual violence in ways that when it is a woman or even the state as the perpetuator, as we're seeing in the case of Occupy Palestine, right? And which brings me to my next question, right? Because a big point of contention is how at least, right, one of the articles that you're bringing up, right, the New York Times article, Screams Without Words, which demonized and falsely accused Hamas of systemic sexual violence on October 7th. One of the authors identifies as a feminist, right? And the New York Times article, right, which famously disregards the systemic sexualized violence Palestinians of all genders, right, and age groups are subjected to at the hands of the Israeli state. And so you call this something of a double genocide, right? And you contextualize this within the same realm of how Black boys and how Black men experience it in the U.S. context as well. So if you can, just like talk about this a bit.
Yeah. When I say a double genocide, you rob a people being able to tell their own story, to tell the truth of what is happening to them, that in fact the Palestinian people, Palestinian men, boys, women, children, were the ones being brutally raped. You demonize the public towards them and kind of prime the psyche of the public to reject anything that a Palestinian has to say. You don't even let them speak, Kamala, then it is a double genocide in the sense that you kill them and you also kill their ability to be seen. You kill their ability to be understood. You kill the ability for them to be able to voice their truth. That is double genocide. And that's when I talk about it in this way, because you've so demonized these people and you've so kind of finessed and primed the public against these people, like Trump is doing with undocumented peoples, that you create in the psyche of the public, oh, these people don't have any humanity. They're savage animals, as Netanyahu has said. So anything can happen to them. As I think it was, I forget, one of the crazies in Netanyahu's cabinet, who actually said when the incident happened of the rape, in the Knesset, they had a deliberation or something above it. And someone actually said, is placing things in this man's rectum, is that acceptable? And I think it was Benny Gantz or Israel Smotrich or one of these sickos that said anything can happen to these people. There's no such thing as against the law or anything when it comes to Palestinians. Anything goes. Anything goes. It's one thing to murder a people. It's another thing to murder their sense of voice and their ability to narrate their own story. The narrator is destroyed. The person who is able to speak for their people. That's why they committed this epistemicide. They've killed all the poets. They've killed all the artists. They killed all the teachers. Why? Because I don't want these people to be able to tell the truth of what's happening to them. They want to create a fiction for the world. Although it's not working, you still have many, many people who are consumed inside of this fiction. When I speak about double genocide, that's what I'm talking, the slaughter of the narrator, the Palestinian people and the Palestinian story.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have a section in your article where you discuss why when the IOF missed the most sadistic and heinous crimes against Palestinian women, it is still impossible for them to view their vile acts as sexual terror against Palestinian women as sexual assault, right? So can you discuss why this is?
Yeah, and it connects to what we just talked about. Like if you kill a person's ability to even have a scintilla, just one amount, tiny infinitesimal amount of credibility, then they're able to be raped, brutalized, slaughtered, abused. It doesn't matter. And they can continuously rape and brutalize Palestinian women and pretend like, only Israeli women suffer from male abuse or something like this because they're Palestinian women. So if you're a Palestinian woman, you don't, there's no such thing as rape because anything is liable. Anything can happen to you because you've been degendered. Angela Davis talked about this. Horton Spillers also talks about the kind of degendering and kind of reduced to flesh, like just reduced to bare flesh, but also still reduced to flesh, but also it's like a gendered degendering or something where they are reduced to flesh, but because they still have the anatomy of a woman, they're able to be raped. You know what I mean? And it's almost in the same way, actually, I'm thinking now, in the phallicism theoretic that Tommy Curry posits, where he talks about like Black men viewed as rapists, labeled and caricatured as rapists, and kept and sustained that way in the minds and the psyches of the Black community and Black feminist thought. Yet they are delectable, desired, fetishized, eroticized, homoeroticized. It's like, they are the rapists, and I call it the rapist-rapey dialectic, where, you a rapist, labeled a rapist, branded a violent, sadistic thug. Yes, you are yearned for, you are hungered for. The Black male body is hungered for, and at the same time as it is being demonized. So in the same way, when I talk about Palestinian women, they have been ripped of womanhood, but still fetishized as women. You know what I mean? I don't know if this is making sense, but that's the kind of way that's the kind of train that I was working through in the essay. And this is where I get to sepulchrality, where you have so villainized and psychologically and physically, maimed these people. I mean, Palestine has the highest number of amputees and child amputees that you ever see in the world. It's like, it's a limbo existence between death and dead and clinging to a sense of aliveness. You're in this kind of realm where you're clinging for life, but you're dead. But then you're able to be continuously murdered again and again because you've been ripped of the ability to narrate your story. And so your very sense of self, you exist only in the imaginary of the white sadist, the Israeli white supremacist mind. You only exist inside of their imaginary. So you're ripped of yourself and then forms a constructed sense of self that is gutted and that is skeletal and that is dead. I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, yeah, I think it does. And I kind of wanted to talk about just like these incredibly contradictory understandings of racialized and colonized people, but specifically in this case, the men, right? In that like Black men can simultaneously be feminine and subordinate and childlike while also being, I'm saying, quite the opposite as well, right? Simultaneously, right? And it's this like, it's practically, right? The racialized or colonized man it's just anything that the empire wants it to be at any given point in time. And that's a really fascinating like dialectic to me because I think I see it reflected even in progressive understandings as well, right? Where it's like, again, and I think one of the things that I think, one of the big issues that I think people have with Black male studies or with Tommy Curry specifically is that they feel he is obscuring, right, the violences that Black men can and do participate in, right? And they can and do perpetuate, right? And I think that the people don't understand that even you can be, and I hate that I'm even like having to address this, but it's, we have to ultimately. So,
yeah.
But it's like, I think that what I've understood from it is that like, it's not that Black men can't and don't like participate or perpetuate certain forms of violences, but rather that they've been overrepresented as perpetuators of these violences, as opposed to being where they most often are, which is victims. Right. And so like they're underrepresented as victims of these violences, but overrepresented as perpetuators of these violences. And this goes again, not just for conservatism or from empire itself, but also from like these like left progressivism or left progressive literature that I'm seeing and we've seen historically speaking pop up as you're mentioning, right? We're seeing this even amongst like feminists and specifically Black feminists as well, right? Which again, predominantly takes a liberal orientation, if that makes sense. And so like, along the same vein, I love that you refer to the Delectable Negro, for example, a human consumption and homoeroticism within U.S. slave culture by Vincent Woodard. Truly one of my favorite books. I highly recommend it. I recommend it all the time. But I want to discuss this point that, and I'm quoting here, capitalist imperialism suffers an historical homoerotic consumptive appetite for this flesh and blood of colonized people, end quote. And this is in relation to both Palestinian and Black men. So if you want to just touch on that a bit.
Yeah, it goes back to the phallicism thing, but it also goes back to, I was listening to a lecture by Tommy Curry. He talks about the way that a young white, I think girl actually, described lynching and how she is so enthralled by watching a Black man be lynched, and she starts to talk about his private parts and starts to talk about how they look as they're being lynched, how he looks as the blood is leaving his body and becomes cold. And it's almost like she's having an erotic experience watching this lynching take place. And Vincent Woodard talks about the kind of necrophilic psychosexual drive that guides and pushes white supremacy, the way that white society will subjugate and imprison, Black people, to have as their desires, at their whim, the sexual torture of Black people whenever they feel like it, all throughout history. When we talk about Willie McGee, when we talk about Emmett Till, when we talk about, even I'm reading actually in the book by Domenico Lacerdo, Liberalism, A Counter History, he also touches on a part where he mentions the way the slave owners in the South would like just have sexual access to their slaves. This is a very death-driven, necrophilic, sexualized torture and structure that we live under as Black people. So when we talk about the vicious rape of Black men, and I'm also referring to something that happened over the summer. I don't know if you heard about this I think with Mississippi, where a gang of white police officers broke into the home of two Black men and proceeded to anally rape them. This just happened like a couple months ago. Why doesn't Black feminism speak to these things too? Because like you said, it distorts their narrative. Because now if you bring into the fold that Black men are also sexually abused, then you don't this whole thing about them being violent, rapists, and having all this power structure over Black women and the kind of disgusting conflation between patriarchy and misogyny, it all begins to disintegrate. And so they pretend like these things aren't happening. They pretend like it never happened. Actually, I actually mentioned this book on Twitter or X, whatever it's called nowadays. And, it was just completely dismissed. Someone asked me if I was slow, if I was dumb. And again, I don't want to, because you have to kind of belabor these points. This is not to say that me as a Black woman to disregard my own experience. How the fuck I'm going to disregard my own experience? I live and breathe an existence of a Black woman. That's my positionality. But I need a framework that's going to speak to the strife of a whole people, not just dismiss the pain of one group to prop up another group. That is how do you not see that as destructive? So yeah, when to speak of like the consumptive appetite of white supremacy, capitalistic structure, the way that it attacks and feeds off of Black bodies, the way it, commodifies Black bodies, puts them on the market, these markets going in, plundering, pillaging Africa, pillaging communities in the South, convict leasing, penal codes. I mean, this is the appetite of capitalism, white supremacy. It just bleeds and it hungers for Black flesh while it dehumanizes Black flesh. Yeah, and I just also wanted to speak to, I can't remember how many brothers have told me personally, that their first sexual experience has been with an older woman, or that they were kind of, they were raped essentially by, Black women, and, feeling some shame about it, but, wanting to just pass it off like, yeah, it's a rite of passage or something, and not really grappling with how that first experience has kind of like psychologically hurt them so much. It's something that Black feminism just can't speak to it, because then their whole framework would just break down.
Mm-hmm. And this I know we kind of touched on this earlier, but this is something I've been struggling with for many years as someone who's studied and learned from a lot of many feminists and owe a great debt to, right? I know I've already said this, so I'm saying it again, right? To self-proclaimed Marxists over third world or transnational and anti-imperialist feminisms, right? For their intellectual and political contributions. But I want to have a more thorough discussion with you about like, what is there to do with feminism then, right? And again, I've been reading a lot of literature that is hypercritical of feminism's white supremacist and imperialist genealogy, right? But it is also true that there is an increasingly rightward shift happening, and women and girls are experiencing a disproportionate amount of the violence that is an expression of that, right? And of course, feminism does not have a monopoly on women's liberation struggle, as I said earlier, right? That would be absurd to say, and it's quite the opposite, actually. But there exists a struggle for women's liberation in contexts where the term feminism is not even uttered, right? But I would just like to hear what you imagine for this personally, right? Especially in the U.S. context, where it seems that feminism has become increasingly institutionalized, increasingly liberal, right? As opposed to being engaged in and concerned with grassroots social and political struggle. And so I ask this of you and many people who will be listening to this, right? Can feminism be redeemed or resuscitated, ultimately so?
I mean, I would just want to speak to the first part of your question first. Like, Marxism, we have Nadezhda Krupskaya, we have Queen Mother Moore, we have Claudia Jones. We have these women who didn't label themselves feminist, but fought for every Black woman and child. They didn't necessarily take that label, but that's all their work was. There's a conference that happened before the Bandung Conference. The book was written by Lisa Armstrong. It's remissing me the title of the book or something, but there was this women's conference, African and Asian women, and it was such a strong anti-imperialist sentiment and guiding framework to the conference. They were working with women, they were like doing political education in our communities, taking care of our children, just to take a bit of a tangential turn. I have, people close to me and my family, going through different things with men in their lives, and, speaking with them and nurturing them and trying to pull them away from this toxic, relationship, but not indicting the brother, not, saying like, fuck that nigga, like, you don't need nobody, just like, let's just do this feminist thing. And I'm like, no, let's get away from this person and, let's work for something better. Let's imagine something better. But I don't need to drag, a brother through the mud to make a point. to uplift my sister, is what I'm saying. I don't need to drag our people through the mud to uplift the women in our community. And so doing the work of helping women is doing the work of Black liberation. I don't see the two as two separate things. Claudia Jones didn't see it as two separate things. Elaine Brown didn't see it as two separate things, whatever critiques we have of her. And Erica Huggins, she spoke so beautifully that she, talked about the murder of her husband and how it, drove her work and helping women, and how she said that she made a vow to always help the Black community. I don't think these things are separate, and I don't think they're separate from Marxism. I think they're Engels, when he wrote Private Property in the State, he talked about the horrific condition of women in Europe at the time. Marx spoke to the degraded position of women. Marxism encompasses these things. Now, I do think that there is I don't know if I like that term right-wardship, because I think we've always existed in a rightism, but a more violent or more like overt rightism. The way that Trump is able to mobilize his fascistic bands and things, we can't pretend like there isn't a difference there. I think that as we talk about the fight for trans rights that's happening, the fight for abortion rights that's happening, LGBTQIA rights, it can't take on this culturalist thing. It can't be decentered and de-radicalized, because it's been completely de-radicalized, where it's just like, I just want to wear a t-shirt that says, feminist power, or I just want to wear, LGBTQIA, and it just means nothing. We have Richie Torres in the Bronx who, pink washes everything. Or people talk about the way I can hold hands with my husband in Israel and it's no problem. And they're killing everybody. But, I'm able to go to this cute gay nightclub. And, we need to just have a thorough analysis, a critical analysis, especially as Marxists, as people engage in Pan-African movements, African socialism, wherever you're at with it. We need a more critical analysis of these things. I've literally heard, people mention something like, I just want to work with women and non-men. This is anti-Black nonsense to me. This is so liberalized and so gutted from any revolutionary potential. What the hell are you talking about? So I think when we talk about liberation movements and women, when we talk about Pan-Africanism, when we talk about African socialism, Marxism, Marxist-Leninism, we're talking about the liberation of women, because within that framework is the liberation of all oppressed peoples. And I just, I really would like for people to go back and read things like Engels' Private Property in the State. He speaks directly to the condition of women. Directly. Huey speaks directly to the condition of women. Harry Haywood, all of these great thinkers speak directly to the degraded conditions that women go through. But it has to be within the struggle, the broader liberatory framework. We can't siphon it off. We can't truncate it and put it somewhere else. And it can't be disfigured. It has to be integrated within the movement for liberation and not severed, in order for it to work for everybody.
Absolutely. You mentioned a book about the conference. And it was actually, I don't know if it's the same one that you're talking about, but Bury the Corpse of Colonialism.
Yeah, that's the book, because I couldn't remember the name.
Yeah, the Revolutionary Feminist Conference of 1949. We had the author on last year, I want to say. I lost all contact of time at this point. But yeah, we had her on, and so it was a really good conversation. It's a really excellent book. People should definitely check it out if they can. But yeah, on that point, I want to revise something I said earlier, which was that the feminist struggle is mostly cultural and not political. And when I say I want to revise it, and it's to say that it's not really concerned with radical political struggle, more so because I do think that's a more liberal integrationist point of view, which I think can be helpful. I'm not saying that like it should be thrown away or pretend like it's like not important at all. Because like as you mentioned, right, the struggle for right, reproductive freedoms, things like that is absolutely crucial. And it's that it is a crucial terrain of the struggle as well. But I think through the broader, though, what you're speaking to, right, it's like how to like integrate and not like siphon off these like different aspects of the struggles. I feel like people do that a lot. And I think we had a conversation with Robert Ferguson a while back, who wrote a book called One-Dimensional Queer. And one of the main points in the book is that like, one of the queer liberation struggle was like siphoned off in that same way. Right, gay rights became divorced from anti-imperialist struggle, from anti-capitalist struggle, and we're seeing these very things happening. But we've seen this very thing happen with the feminist or the feminist struggles, historically speaking, that like it becomes detached from the wider, broader struggle for liberation. And I do think that like a lot of people see when like there are, again, sexism or misogyny in certain like socialist and communist organizations as well. And I think when people see these things, these phenomena happening, they feel the need to like be divorced or like you make their own like little thing on the side, as opposed to like further like doubling down on it and integrating those struggles right together. And that's something that I think we even see this, for example, right, the Claudia Jones point that you make earlier, like Claudia and Harry Hayward and those types, like they made, the Black Nation thesis, for example, or like just like Black nationalism of a major point of struggle within the Communist Party. Like they had to struggle for that. Right. Yeah. Amongst their like, amongst organizers. It was a militant thing that they had to like continue to go on and emphasize. And I think people kind of like think that, because we're rejected or because like there's like this antagonism that happens that we have to go do our own thing on the other side. And it's like, yeah, sure. But also at the same time, like you should try to make sure that you're doing everything that you can to make sure these struggles, which we know, right? Mm-hmm. At least ideologically speaking, we know these struggles are intertwined in one way or another. And then people still feel the need that like we have to like have these single issue parties, if that makes sense. And I think that is like, it's why one of the reasons why we're fractured today, I think, on political lines. And that which kind of gets me to like my next and last question for you, because you offer this like striking indictment of like Western Marxism, right? Specifically, its tendency towards heavy paternalism and chauvinism, as you put it, and how it looks scoldingly at global South liberation movements. So I just want to like end this off with like maybe our discussion, because you kind of end the piece off kind of with the critique of like Western organizations, Western left organizations, generally speaking. And I think it's like it folds into like how we understand. We've been talking about feminism as well, like that this criticism, right? These ruthless criticism is not just reserved for one aspect, but of it all, if that makes sense. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you for asking me that. Like it all just coalesces and it all connects because, it suffers the same kind of liberal hijacking. It's a liberal hijacking. I remember I was reading something by, I don't know if it's Michael Cluscard, that, actually learning about this French theorist, but not like French theory in like the kind of like morbid. That this is actually like someone who was quite critical of, the 68 theorists and things like that's a whole other conversation. But he talked about libertarianism or something. I think that's the framework he uses, where it's just like everything just becomes swallowed in this liberal kind of framework, where it's like even, you could talk about like the theory of like sublation, where, your rage can kind of just gets co-opted back into the state to serve like the ideological hegemony of the state, which, kind of like a Gramscian kind of concept, or even like Althusserian kind of building on those thinkers and things like that, where we're not even doing a revolutionary project anymore. We're just, we've de-radicalized gay rights, we've de-radicalized women's rights, and now we're just doing like a super liberal version that has been fed back to us to be in service of the very thing that we say that we want to deconstruct and extinguish. And, we don't realize it. We don't understand it. And so when I talk about Western Marxism, not only organization, but just the whole movement, like suffers from this not understanding of a labor aristocracy, downplaying imperialism, glossing over racism to just mean like, let's just fight against, and let's have this like nebulous anti-racist campaign, which doesn't really get to the root of the self-determination for Black and oppressed peoples. And in the same way that the state has co-opted, the civil rights movement, where it's like, now it's like all of the organizing, all of the murder, all of the pain that was the civil rights movement became consumed by the state in service of the state. And now it's like, we're going to give you a holiday. And this is kind of what Western Marxism does. Like, it's, as soon as you kind of move beyond a sort of theoretical or even a very lukewarm analysis of racism into like actual praxis mode and actually doing the critical thinking and critical analysis of the conditions, then it's like, oh, this is authoritarianism. This is not nuanced enough. Western Marxism really suffers from, I call it the over-under intellectualism, but it's even more than that. It's so removed from Marx, where it's really just peddling a reformism. And, Gabriel Rockhill actually talks a lot about this when he talks about the kind of compatible left theory, where it's like Marxism, okay, let's reconfigure Marxism so that it is more compatible with ideology of the state, where it's completely gutted of its revolutionary potential. And then you just have like a fight for distribution of resources. And as long as you don't get too overboard and start demanding too much, this Marxism thing, it can work for us. And, what can I say else more about it? I just feel like, Domenico Losurdo is really, really essential to the book Western Marxism. I really recommend that people read it because it shows the chauvinistic liberalism that has always been at the bedrock of Western Marxism. I mean, even when we talk about the historic Communist Party, it suffered so deeply and still suffers so deeply from the chauvinism, regardless of the great people that they have there, that instead of moving towards a militant liberation-based framework, it is more of just like, we kind of want to fight for integration and recognition, and we want to fight for, reforms within the system. We don't want to denounce the two-party dictatorship because that's going too far. We don't want to give people the ability to imagine their lives without the capitalist parties. We just kind of want to go with the less demonic, stringent capitalist party that is essentially, I call it like a lethal injection. It's killing you slow, but you don't realize it because you're enjoying yourself as the death happens.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate that a lot because I do think that it's like, I feel like if you would take seriously, like, okay, I'm right now, I keep talking about this because it's like one of my main projects that I'm working on now, but it's like, I've been doing a lot of I'm helping edit Ruben Wahid's, like a bunch of his papers and his depositions, legal depositions, things like that. And so I'm like reading a lot of like his narrations of like the destruction of the Black Panther Party, and then as an extension, the destruction of the Black Liberation Army. And then ultimately the destruction of the Black Power movement in the 70s. And then, but everything that I'm like, people understand what happened to Malcolm X. People understand what happened to Martin Luther King. People understand what happened to like Black Panther Party on like vague terms. Like, oh yeah, the state killed people, like incarcerated people. Like, yeah. But I think people took seriously the intricacies of how that took place. And prior to even beyond the more sensationalized elements of just like political assassinations, right? Everyone knows, like, not everyone, but like a lot of people know, at least on the left, knows that the story of Frank Hampton, right? Knows that the story of obviously Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. But like the more intricacies of like how it disrupted even the daily activities that a lot of these organizations, these communist organizations, were undergoing, right? Even from even the early examples, right? The Communist Party USA, for example, a lot of the tactics that were used, right, that could legitimately be translated and seen even happening in places like Vietnam, these counterinsurgent practices, if that makes sense, that can be like translated from time and space. The state was mobilizing the same tactics it was using in Vietnam and in the Philippines against, racialized, colonized radical groups in the U.S. context, for example, right? And I think we took seriously these like the intricacies of how this took place, and the absolutely like annihilation that took place, right? Beyond just the assassination of individual leaders, because it's much bigger than that, right? And I think the infamous Fred Hampton quote that you can't kill a revolution. I mean, you can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill a revolution. Like even that, I was talking about this recently. It's like, I get why he said it and I get how he said it, but I think I disagree.
Mm.
And I think that we're like living embodiments of that defeat. Of the fact that like they did in fact kill a revolution, and that we are in this place where like we are like so vastly fractured, not just as a people, but like even on like the left itself. Like we just like specifically focus on the left itself. We have such little like relevance to our communities. We have such a little like, and it's like, and like no one can truly say that their like political ideology has a solution to it at the moment. And if we were to be humbled and like truly humble ourselves and approach this from a point of humility, right? And a point of like, actually, I don't think that the feminists have an answer to this. I not only think that like the Marxist organization either have an answer to this. And I think that like if we have to go back to the drawing board and like start over, and that doesn't mean obviously we can, you borrow from like, different contexts. Like, of course we can, right? We should borrow from like previous periods. We should borrow from other contexts, of course. But it's like almost like we almost have to remake this shit in a way because this has been so deeply compromised by the state. And I don't think people take that seriously. And I think people think about these assassinations and they think about the destruction of these organizations as simply just like past events that happened. And like, but now why does the state, which went so fucking hard on the Communist Party, went so fucking hard on the Black Panther Party, on other worker organizations and racialized organizations, of course, right? Why does it allow these current organizations to exist in the form that it does? With very little, like, obviously there's, I'm not trying to like throw anybody under the bus. This is why I'm like struggling with this a bit. But it's like, why is it allowed to exist? So if it's allowed to exist, we have to understand it in two ways, right? It's either you're so powerless and so irrelevant that the state doesn't give a fuck about you, or you are categorically compromised. So which was it? And that's the kind of like, and again, I don't think being compromised means that like you're like, because we're all in one way or another compromised, of course, right? We're all in one, like we like the fact that like I have bills to pay and I help support my family and I'm saying that I'm not going to go blow up the White House. Simple. I'm compromised, right? And like there's a humility that comes with that. There's humility that comes with the fact that like I can only do so much when it comes to, contributing to like a movement to free Palestine. Most of us can. Most of us are not engaged in militant struggle at the moment. Simply, right? Most of us are like putting band-aids on a sinking ship basically at the moment, right? And that's the most understanding. There's no shame in that either. And I think that it's like, but to me, there's such a lack of humility on so many segments of like the progressive left. And it's like, and we're not actually being truthful. And I think a lot of finger pointing of like why things fail, why things are not in the place that we needed to be. And it's like, when the point of the matter is that we lost and that we're losing and that like none of us actually truly have a solution in our present context. And if we took that seriously, then we would be more like, again, because like people are going to listen to this conversation and they really like go ham on us because the cool thing is,
I already know it's coming.
It's coming, right? And it's like, I don't know. And it's like, but I think that's how we has to be, because we have to account for the fact that like, okay, like I don't think it's working. I don't think like again, I say to someone who participated in this once, who participated in like the oh, fuck man are trash. It's a queer person, right? Someone who like has been victimized by, you know, homophobia and, you know, and these but still, I don't think the language that we're mobilizing is captivating people. And again, it's not activating people into political struggle. I don't think it's getting us any further towards like the goal. I don't think it's like, so even if the point is in the goal should be to like get more and more Black men involved in struggle, get more and more Black men involved in like anti-patriarchal violence, right? And like I'm saying, getting them into a more progressive analytic, ultimately so. I don't think it has successfully done that.
Right.
And then I also look at the left, right? Or like the Marxist left as well. And it's like, it also like, there's like a lot of Black people don't give a fuck about it. It's irrelevant to a lot of Black folks, to be quite honest with you. And it has also failed to like deliver those results as well in this current moment, in this specific context, right? And so, I don't know, this is a long ass ramble, but it's like, I think it's like, I don't know. Yeah, if you have any ending thoughts, I think I'm going to stop there, but yeah.
I really appreciate it, and I think that as someone, like, I do tenant organizing in Brooklyn, been with this organization for a long time, it's something that, we struggle with because, like you said, yeah, you can actually kill a revolution. And we've been so severely maimed,
Right.
theoretically and practically.
Right.
And then we have people within these organizations that they wanna keep a certain power structure. They want things to be a certain way, that they're willing to drive out anybody who really wants to uphold Marxist-Leninist principles, just because they don't want they don't want their leadership status or their whole organization to be challenged. I'm not saying that you should go into any organization and just try to, do some shit or like, do some like wrecking behavior because you feel like you have the best line. No, you have to struggle within your organization. You have to struggle, and the struggle has to be genuine. Being a former member of the Communist Party, I left the party in this past summer. I'm being in the organization for a couple years, like, 4 years. And ultimately just feeling like theoretically things aren't going anywhere, but still respecting, the organization and the people inside that organization because, organizational work is not easy. And it's not like this, very utopian picture where, everyone is super based and, when you're dealing with intergenerational things and as a party that has been so traumatized and so cut down by the state and the FBI, it's natural that revisionism is going to occur. It's how you deal with it and if it's being dealt with at all, or if it's allowed to kind of metastasize and fester and no one says anything because, it becomes hard to criticize people in the organization because you've grown to have a familiar relationship. And I think, honestly, it's one of the worst things when someone feels like afraid to criticize this person within an organization because that's your friend or something. And I can only imagine how many movements have suffered because people just feel afraid to put the organization on the right track. It's not going to happen overnight, but you see how organizations become less and less militant because they don't want to challenge their own liberalism. There's no self-critique within the West. They've abandoned criticism. Lenin says this in multiple texts that he has about criticism of the party being so essential to the lifeblood of the party. If you don't critique, and not a vulgar critique, but if like a good faith critique, then you're not moving the party forward. And it's just going to be like a skeletal remain of the great party it used to be. And that's what our movements have suffered. And I do think you have some parties who are doing some things, doing some good work, whether or not they can actually, build up the forces necessary to really challenge something, it's up to them. It's up to how much you want to be honest that you're compromised, and that maybe, you know, you have to sift some things around. You have to let go of some people that you really like, and you have to do things. If you say you, and this is why, you know, we're not serious, because if there's no self-reflection, there's no seriousness. You know, self-reflection, not to just acknowledge like, yeah, I did something wrong, or, you know, yeah, we should have raised this amount of fundraiser instead of that, but honest self-reflection. Where you say, theoretically, we have been in the mud. We have not been paying attention to the way the theory has been informing our practice, because we don't have a strong theoretical base, and then we don't have a strong connection to our neighborhoods. No one knows who the fuck we are. And it's because, you know, this is why I think theory is so essential. And Lenin speaks to this, and Stalin speaks to this as well. It's like, if you don't understand the structure and the foundation, if you don't have a critical analysis of the condition, and if you're not going back and not reading Marx and Lenin to fill up your head with all kinds of ideas, but to really inform change in yourself and your community, then what are you doing? What are you really doing? We of course we can't be of service to our communities, because we're not even critically analyzing the text. We're not understanding and pulling out the meat and the innards of the text. Not just reading something and attaching yourself as a Marxist, and that becomes your whole like aesthetic, but really, really using the text to analyze the social conditions, the economic relations, and seeing how the text can really breathe life into your understanding. It's not a kind of pontification, masturbatory kind of activity. Your reading of the text is a self-critical analysis, and an analysis to where you can glean the insight from the text to apply it to your everyday life and your organizing, and how you really intend to move things forward. Not to be a YouTube personality, or to be everyone's favorite Twitter personality or TikTok person. This is really poor. If your theory stops at TikTok, I really don't know, like,
Right.
where you're going with this. And so I feel like Western Marxism has suffered because there is no self-criticism. There's not an honest self-critique. Sometimes I hear people, throwing self-critique, but if you have self-critique but no change, and you don't really want to activate yourself, and you don't realize, like you were saying, are you going to get up and I hear people talk all day about we need to be armed. Are you really fucking going to go out there and do something? I really, let's stop. Okay. Like, if you were really serious, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. I just think it speaks to the seriousness. It speaks to the really phrase mongering ultra leftism that we've sunken into the kind of rightist mindset that we have, that we bail in a sort of like super ultra left, anarchic kind of personality that we've constructed for ourselves, because we don't want to deal with the material reality in front of us. We don't want to. And when I say material reality, it's not excluding the realm of the consciousness, because I think there's a lot of vulgar rise Marxism happening. But to the dialectical way into the conscious realm informs the material realm, and moving in that, understanding that, and analyzing yourself. This is so important to the lifeblood of Marxism. I didn't become a Marxist-Leninist because I read something. I became a Marxist-Leninist because I was working in the hair store, and the nigga was treating me like shit, and I didn't have no motherfucking hot water, and a bitch was fucking tired, and I was miserable. And I was like, I read Marx one day, and I was like, this is it for me. I swear, I was like, I cannot, where have I been doing? Like, this is what it is. And I actually read Marx around the same time that I was discovering Buddhism and Hinduism. And it just really changed my life because of that notion of self exploration in a real way and not a vulgarized, bastardized way.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end off and allow to, fester with folks. But before I let you go, can you tell folks where they can find you and keep up with your work? And if anything you want to shout out or that you're working on, or, just generally speaking. But yeah.
Yeah, I really hope that people get something from this, and I hope I'm understood a little bit better.
Of course.
Because I really do care about my sister. But I think what we have now is not a sisterhood. Mm-hmm. It's a sisterhood for an elite group of people with a certain kind of idea. And if you don't fit into the group, you're not a part of the sisterhood. And I don't know how that's helping us build formative and loving, true relationships where, you're not afraid to disagree. I feel like if you're in a friendship or if you're in some sort of organizational relationship or any relationship and you feel that sort of tension where you're afraid to disagree, this is not it. I think we need to examine these things, and we need to examine how we've been propagandized against, our own communities and our own people, and upholding racist stereotypes from the 19th century, mm-hmm. and against, our own people, and then saying that we're radical. Like, this shit don't make no sense. So in saying that, I hope people got something from that. I'm going to be publishing some more things. You could also, look for me. I'm putting out a little EP soon, and I'm hoping to have that ready, within the next couple months. Yeah, you can find me, I'm on Twitter at Khadijah Haynes 1, I think it is. I don't even remember what the ad is. Or Instagram by the same name. But yeah, I'm an organizer and I'm a cultural worker. And then I'm an Afro Trinidadian woman. And, I'm a poor Black woman, just in the hood in my community, just trying to really not even make a change, but make a disruption. And
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where that's where I am from with it. That's where I'm coming from.
Appreciate you. Yeah, this is great. So Khadijah, I appreciate you so much for coming on. And we certainly have you on again in the future when you have more workout, especially that we can focus on as well. But yeah, I appreciate your experience in your writing and for talking with me today.
So thank you. I actually wrote that article last year sometimes, and it didn't come out publicly, and work with it. Right. People read it, in the party, outside of the party, and I just decided to let me actually put it out, and I'm happy I did, even though some people are not too happy.
Right. Yeah, as always, you gotta take it with. Go with it, I guess. But yeah, so I'm gonna let you go. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much.
Bye.